The Roman invasion nearly brought the rebellious Jews to ruin, but unexpectedly they received a respite due to a change of ruling regime in the center of the empire. In anticipation of the approaching civil war in Italy, the Romans left the rebels alone for a while. Instead of seizing this opportunity to bolster defenses, the rebels immediately engaged in internecine fighting with each other. The loss of Galilee caused a serious rift in the ranks of the Jewish rebels, who blamed the aristocratic government for the failure. Throughout the year, Jerusalem was filled with crowds of refugees from the Roman-ravaged regions. With the growing discontent of the masses gathered in the city, the Zealots again took the offensive. Their leader Eleazar ben Simon controlled the Temple Mount and through his supporters succeeded in establishing a new order for the office of high priest. Henceforth he was to be elected by lot from a wide range of candidates. The first to be elected was Phannias, who was a man of the simplest origin. The aristocrats were not about to give up. In winter, the citizens, incited by them, revolted and pushed the Zealots into the inner courtyard of the temple. Being outnumbered, they called the Idumeans for help on the advice of John ben Levi of Gishala, claiming that the enemy was preparing treason. About 20,000 fighters from Idumea soon arrived in Jerusalem, but the inhabitants of the city, aware of their purpose, locked the gates against the Idumeans. To their misfortune, a storm with wind and rain arose on one of the following nights. The Zealots managed to slip past the Temple Mount guard posts unnoticed and let their allies into the city. The government troops fled and the victors massacred the city, killing the leaders of the aristocratic party, including Anan ben Anan. After the wave of murder and plunder subsided, the Idumeans left Jerusalem, which was now under the undivided power of the Zealots. With the coming of spring, Vespasian continued to reduce the territory under the control of the rebels. The army under his command marched from Caesarea southward toward Lydda and Jamnia. After taking possession of these cities, Vespasian marched to Emmaus, where he left the 5th Macedonian Legion to lead the siege. He himself, with the rest of his army, traveled further south to Idumea, where he killed many rebels and destroyed their strongholds. Leaving here to complete the conquest of the southern parts of the country enough troops, with the rest he returned to Emmaus, which was by then already taken by Roman troops. Turning northward from there, he traveled through Samaria with the main forces to Jericho. As the army approached, most of the local inhabitants left their homes and fled to Jerusalem. Those who remained were exterminated by the soldiers. In Jericho the troops were given a short rest. Here they were joined by detachments previously sent to conquer Zaordon. Vespasian thus gained control of most of the country. The center of the rebellion, Jerusalem, was surrounded by a chain of Roman fortifications. Only such fortified points as Masada and Makaren, located in deserted, inaccessible terrain, remained under the control of the rebels. In midsummer Vespasian returned to Caesarea to make final preparations for the siege of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, news came to Caesarea of the revolt in Gaul and Spain and the suicide of Nero. Vespasian postponed the continuation of the Jewish campaign indefinitely and awaited further developments. Initially he recognized Galba's rights and even sent his son Titus to Rome to congratulate him. However, the murder of Galba and the proclamation of Othan and then Vitellius as emperor prompted Vespasian to advance his own claims to power. The prefect of Egypt Tiberius Julius Alexander was the first to proclaim him emperor, and he was followed by the legions in Judea. Vespasian was joined by the governor of Syria Gaius Licinius Mucianus. At a general meeting at Berida, it was decided to send an army to Italy under the command of Mucianus. Vespasian himself at this time occupied Egypt, which served as the breadbasket of Rome. While the troops of Mucianus were on the road, the legions that stood in Moesia and Pannonia also joined Vespasian. Gaius Antonius Primus, who commanded them, moved with his army directly into Italy and in October defeated the Vitellian forces at Cremona. His army entered Rome, Vitellius was killed, and the Senate recognized Vespasian as emperor. The strife in Rome was not good for the rebels, but instead of taking advantage of the respite and preparing the city for battle, the zealots began to fight each other. Eleazar ben Simon and his supporters controlled the Temple Mount. He was opposed by John of Gishala, who drew most of the smaller leaders to his side, as well as the refugees from Galilee who were flooding into Jerusalem. In turn, John was opposed by both moderates from among the townspeople and the remnants of the former aristocratic party, and by radical Sicarians, many of whom were from the southern parts of the country. The latter, in order to get rid of John, called to their aid Simon Bar Giora, a leader of the religious radicals and the peasant poor from Idumea. Simon Bar Giora and his supporters entered Jerusalem and occupied most of it, pushing John back to the upper city. All three factions fought each other viciously. During these clashes, parts of the city were destroyed by fires. The granaries were also burned, and much of the food stored in them perished. While the internecine fighting continued in Jerusalem, the Romans were preparing for the end of the campaign. Titus, appointed commander-in-chief by his father, set out from Alexandria with reinforcements. Moving along the Levant coast through Gaza, Ascalon, Javnia, and Joppa, he eventually reached Caesarea, where the main forces of the Roman army were assembled. En route to Jerusalem, the army was divided into 3 columns. The first, having set out from Caesarea, advanced toward Jerusalem through Samaria and Gothna. Already on the approach to the city, Titus, accompanied by horsemen, went to reconnaissance of the area. Getting carried away, he too close to the wall and was attacked by the Jews, almost captured the Roman commander. Returning to the disposition of his troops, Titus ordered them to camp on Mount Scopus about 3/4 of a mile northeast of the city walls. The 5th Legion, which was under the command of its legate Sextus Ceriolus in camp at Emmaus, approached Jerusalem from the west side on the evening of the same day. Its camp was a little farther from the city. The 10th Legion, commanded by Lartius Lepidus, came from Jericho and camped on the Mount of Olives. The city before the eyes of the Romans was well fortified by nature. It was situated on the tops of 2 hills and was protected by 3 belts of fortress walls. Its highest point was the Temple Mount, a gigantic platform on which the temple building stood. On the western hill, in the time of the Hasmoneans, the upper city arose, where Herod's palace and the mansions of the nobility were located. Between the 2 hills lay the Tyropoeon Valley and the lower city. The upper and lower towns were surrounded by a common, or first wall. On the northern side, the defense of the city was strengthened by 2 more rows of walls. The second wall ran from the fortress of Antonia, adjacent to the Temple Mount, to the western gate. The third wall covered the Betset Plateau, where the new city was located. The city was still plagued by violent internecine struggle. On the eve of Passover, John of Gishel managed to lead his soldiers under the guise of pilgrims into the temple, where they attacked Eleazar and his men with weapons in their hands. It was not until the Roman siege began that the leaders of the opposing parties came to an agreement to act together. On April 23, the Romans began the siege work. Titus decided to begin the assault on the city from the northwest side, where Jerusalem's defenses were most vulnerable. In accordance with this plan, he ordered his soldiers to make a new camp opposite the western gate, and other soldiers to make another camp opposite the Tower of Cephinus. Under his direction, the warriors began vigorously constructing siege mounds, using the remains of the houses of the city's suburbs and trees as building materials. When the preparatory work was finished, the Romans brought battering rams to the walls and set them in motion. Soon, the wall fell. The Romans broke through the breach and captured the new city. Having strengthened on these positions, they then launched an attack on the second wall, which stretched between Antony's fortress and the western gate. Just 4 days after the attack began, this wall also fell. No sooner had the Romans truly gained a foothold in the part of the city they had captured, then the besieged made a sortie and drove them back behind the wall. They then tried to seal the breach, and for 3 days they withstood a new assault. Having retaken the second wall, Titus ordered strong guards to be posted and the remaining fortifications to be destroyed. The warfare, which had been going on for 3 weeks, had exhausted the forces of both sides. The besieged suffered from hunger and the besiegers from thirst. To demoralize the enemy, Titus organized a military parade, where the Roman army lined up in front of the defenders of the city, frozen in amazement. This was followed by an offer of surrender, which Josephus was to deliver to the besieged. The Jews thought he had been killed at the capture of Jotapata, and when they saw Joseph in the Roman camp, they became indescribably furious. A hail of insults and arrows rained down on the parliamentarian. One stone struck him on the head, and Joseph fell to the ground without feeling. The Jews made a sortie to try to take him alive, but they were overtaken by Roman soldiers who carried Joseph back to their camp. Having ascertained the unwillingness of the Jews to surrender the city voluntarily, Titus ordered the construction of 4 mounds, 2 against Antony's fortress and 2 more against the first wall at the western gate. After continuous and strenuous work, the structures were almost complete. The Jews had waited patiently for this moment. In advance they had made an underground passage to the mounds that had been erected at Antony's fortress. The rebels filled the gallery with combustible materials and set fire to the pillars that supported its vault. When the supports burned, the ground sagged and the siege collapsed. 2 days later, inspired by this success, Simon Bar Gior's soldiers launched a swift attack on the mounds against the upper city. After breaking through the enemy's outposts and pushing the soldiers back into their fortified camp, the besieged set fire to the embankments and destroyed the siege guns on them. Thus, in only 2 days the Jews destroyed all the fruits of the enemy's many days of labor. At a council of war held soon afterward, Titus decided to rebuild the siege mounds and completely blockade Jerusalem. The Roman blockade led to a famine in Jerusalem. Food was given only to the soldiers, and the old men and women were left to fend for themselves. The townspeople, suffering from hunger, began to flee the city en masse. The Romans willingly accepted fugitives from the upper property class, but the poor were treated quite differently. To prevent them from leaving the city, Titus had them crucified on crosses in front of the city walls. Thousands of corpses dotted the city's outskirts and became an integral part of the landscape. This time the main Roman forces were directed against Antonia, which served as a stronghold for the defenders of the Temple Mount. In mid-June, John of Gisela, who was defending this fortress, made a new sortie with his supporters against the Roman siege works. This time he failed to take his enemy by surprise. The attackers were defeated and had to return with nothing. After that, the Romans placed a battering ram on the embankment and began to destroy the wall of the fortress. The defenders from above pelted them with arrows and stones. The masonry of the wall did not succumb to the blows of the ram. However, at night the wall suddenly collapsed on its own in the place where earlier the Jews had dug underground passages to destroy the former ramparts. This came as a complete surprise to the Romans. When they tried to invade the breach, they were in for another surprise. In anticipation of the inevitable fall of the wall, the Jews had hastily built a second wall behind it. Although this wall was not of strong construction, the first attack on it was repulsed. On July 5, at dawn, 20 Roman soldiers, who were on duty at that time, accompanied by a standard-bearer, a trumpeter, and 2 horsemen, silently ascended the wall and broke the sleeping guards. Trumpeter trumpeted the signal to attack, after which Titus with selected troops immediately took Antonia. Developing success, the Romans followed the retreating rebels broke into the temple court. Here, realizing that the fate of the city may be decided in the coming hours, the Jews stopped and gave battle. The battle lasted for several hours. In the end the Romans had to retreat, satisfied with the occupation of Antonia. In order to open a wide road to the temple, Titus ordered the soldiers to raise the occupied fortress to the ground and to bring the embankments to the northwestern part of the Temple Mount fortifications. For the next 5 weeks there was incessant skirmishing between small units of both sides. In early August, the Romans finally launched a decisive assault. The battering rams again began to hit the walls, but their masonry of huge, tightly fitted together stones weighing several tons each, did not yield to the blows. Titus ordered the soldiers to set fire to the gates leading to the outer galleries of the temple. When they burned, the Romans broke into the courtyard of the sanctuary, pushing the rebels into the building of the temple itself. Fierce fighting continued here. The defenders barricaded themselves inside, constantly counter-attacking and pelting their opponents with stones from the roof of the building. By order of Titus, the temple was set on fire by the attackers and burned to the ground along with the people sheltering there. With the fall of the temple, the rebels of John of Gisela cleared the Temple Mount and retreated to the upper city. Titus offered them one last time to surrender, but this offer, like the previous ones, was rejected. Without much difficulty, the Romans occupied the lower city left by the defenders and began to prepare to storm the citadel of the rebels. 4 siege mounds were laid against the walls of Herod's palace. On September 7 the work was completed, and on the same day a battering ram made a breach in the wall. After this, all resistance of the rebels ceased. Breaking into small groups, they tried to find an escape route or a place to hide. The soldiers stormed into the city, massacring the population here. Houses were looted and then set on fire. Thus Jerusalem fell after a 5-month siege that required enormous effort and sacrifice on the part of the victors. Judea paid dearly for its resistance. Jerusalem, the largest city and the Jerusalem Temple, the center of religious life of the Jewish people, were razed to the ground. Only the 3 towers of the citadel and the western part of the bypass wall were left intact by order of Titus, so that posterity could see for itself how large the city was and how strong the fortifications were. Many of the captives were sent to work in the Egyptian mines or were killed during the games which, to celebrate the victory, Titus organized in Caesarea, Berytus, and Antioch. The tallest and handsomest young men were selected for the triumph at Rome, which was jointly celebrated by Vespasian and Titus in the spring of 71. In the triumphal procession they carried the booty captured during the sacking of Jerusalem and led the captured leaders of the revolt. At the end of the triumph Simon Bar Giora was executed, and Johanan of Gishel was thrown into prison, where he died. With the fall of Jerusalem the Jewish war was not over. Several inaccessible fortresses in the south still remained in the hands of the rebels. Lucilius Bassus, appointed governor of Judea, received under his command the 10th Rapid Legion, with which he continued military operations against the rebels. The chronology and sequence of events of this campaign are not clear. Herodion, located on the edge of the desert, was most likely taken among the first. Then came the turn of Machaeron, located in the lands east of the Jordan. Lucilius Bassus laid siege to the fortress and began to build an embankment, while the rebels made raids to interfere with his work. During such a raid, Eleazar, one of their commanders, was captured. The Roman commander ordered the prisoner to be crucified in front of the walls of the fortress, and his horrible fate prompted the Jews to surrender. Masada, located on the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea, was the last to fall. The fortress was occupied by several hundred Sicarii and their families, about 1,000 men in all, led by Eleazar ben Yair. By then Lucilius Bassus had died suddenly, and his successor Lucius Flavius Silva was in command. He led to the walls of Masada legion and auxiliary forces. The Romans set up 8 camps around the fortress and built a long wall. At the eastern slope of the mountain, on top of which stood Masada, the Romans began to build an embankment, on which they installed a siege tower and a battering ram. On the night before the assault, all the defenders of the fortress, whose situation was hopeless, committed suicide. With the fall of Masada, the history of the Jewish revolt ended.